Hey everybody, before we get started, I just wanted to quickly apologize about the background noise. You'll probably hear it a lot going forward because it is hot in my studio, and if I didn't have the AC on, I would probably pass out while recording. So I just wanted to let you know why there's some background constant humming if that does come through the mic. I'm not sure that it will or won't, but I just wanted to give you a quick warning. With that said, I am Alex, and this is Bento Radio. And before we get into what we're talking about this week, I just wanted to let you know of a couple of things. First off, I keep saying it, this is a YouTube video now on top of also being a normal audio podcast. I finally got a lot of the kinks ironed out, and everything's looking pretty good so far. I'm pretty happy with where the YouTube videos are at. But if you haven't checked out the YouTube channel, be sure to look in the description of every episode. There'll be a link to the YouTube channel. And if you want to subscribe to the podcast so you can just listen to me out into the world, you can look up the podcast in your podcast app of choice, or you can just put this on and listen to the audio. But on that note, a couple more things. First, you can follow me over on Blue Sky. There'll be a link to that in the description of the podcast in the feed. And you can also check out my webcomic. The first season finished, I want to say, about a month ago at the time of this recording. And that is a webcomic called Bullshit News. You can check that out, like I said, in the description of the podcast episode in the podcast feed. So, without further ado, let's toss it over to I for a synopsis of the show we'll be talking about. And that is a show from this season. And that show is, I think it's one of those long things. From Old Country Bumpkin to Master Swordsman. Take it away, I. With the plot synopsis out of the way, I just wanted to say a few things about how the next couple weeks of the podcast are going to go. Since I have been, in fact, watching stuff for this entire season, I'll be touching on the stuff that I largely covered in my what I'm watching this season episode that you can go check out. It's actually an audio only. Although I think that one's in audio only. But you can definitely go check that out on the podcast feed, and that will give you a rough guide to the shows I'm talking about. But I'm kind of talking about them a little bit in the order that they finish, just so I get this stuff out immediately after the show ends, and I can put my thoughts to to a meaningful purpose. But on that note, I want to talk a little bit about kind of what-if statements and why I like them so much. Because in point of fact, what-if statements are kind of lead to a lot of great shows. They can also lead to a lot of stinkers. And what I mean by that is every isekai show is essentially a what-if statement. And what that looks like is you die or get transported. You die in your reality, and you get transported to another reality. And this is essentially a way for storytellers to get modern personalities in fantasy stories. And, high fantasy stories used to be much more common before the advent of isekai, but in this case, in the case of this show, in the case of, I'm just going to call it Country Bumpkin. In the case of, I might even just call it Bumpkin. In the case of Country Bumpkin, it's not an isekai story, but these kinds of what ifs really came back into vogue because of all the flooding of all the isekai stories that are coming out right now, and have been coming out for like the better part of a decade. It's been a while, but in any event, most of them center around teenage characters because that's the demographic of anime. Whether we want to think about it or not, old guys like me are not the primary demographic for anime, especially not shonen anime, which is what a lot of isekai stories fall into. You're gonna get characters who are in their teens or close to in their teens, like think middle school to college age, and you're gonna get those characters in that age range for a reason. That doesn't mean the stories can't be compelling and interesting. Look at something like like the show from a bunch of years back called The Executioner and Her Life and Times. You can go watch that over on High Dive, but that's a really interesting take on the isekai concept, just as a thing, because in that show you're introduced to a fantasy world that has had tons of people isekai'd into it. And very quickly in that show, you find this like world that is shaped by visitors from another time and reality. Like that, you realize pretty quickly in that show that they have trains because somebody showed up from a time period that already had trains, and they just created trains into existence. That like stuff looks a certain way in the world of that show because other people have been isekai'd into it to such an extent that it's like changing the fabric of that fantasy world to such an extent that, spoilers for The Executioner and Her Life and Times, but you should really go watch it. It's actually pretty excellent. To such an extent that the church is taking a stand of like, if you don't clear it with us, we're gonna send an assassin to kill whoever you summon because it's not safe. Like, these people get summoned and they have these insane powers, and who the hell knows what they do. But like, that's a kind of deconstruction and playing with the isekai genre. What the isekai genre is trying to get to, and probably the one that does this the best, is Jobless Reincarnation, Mushoku Tensei. But what they're trying to get at is they're trying to get at a kind of fantasy setting that functions very much like a video game, essentially. Something like Sword Art Online, or once again, Mushoku Tensei, or all kinds of isekai. The Reborn as a Slime. Name your isekai. It usually has some kind of video game-esque setting. It usually has conversations about its world that are very rooted in not just video games, but like D&D and tabletop gaming. But recently there have been a couple more straight fantasy shows that are dispense with the isekai trappings of it and say, no, we want to tell a fantasy story, and we don't want the like abstraction of isekai to kind of like helps the medicine go down, so to speak. And largely these shows are better served for that, because they don't have to they don't have to deal with like the genre conventions of isekai. They don't have to deal with like hitting a kid with a truck at the very beginning of your show. But in this case, they went a step further. Like I said, most anime focus largely on teenagers or young adults. There is josei and seinen shows that focus on older, more mature themes or characters, but even in a like kind of relentlessly seinen thing like say Black Lagoon, the characters are still in their 20s, maybe in their early 30s, especially in terms of Revy and Rock in that show. But the themes are more explicitly adult, and they deal with less kind of like teenage themed stuff. Where this show differs from many shows is that its main character is just in his 30s. And we've seen this one other time fairly recently. Actually, not one other time, but like we've seen this a bunch of times at this point. But the most recent one is Kaiju number 8. And in the very beginning of Kaiju number 8, both the manga and the anime, Kafka, the main character, who is just 35, has this whole conversation with himself and therefore the viewer of like, I had a dream, it didn't work out, I'm 35, I'm in the middle of life, like I gotta live. And the main character, Beryl, in this show's case, very much feels like there was a point at which he was young and hungry, but now he's a teacher in his family's dojo, and that's the way it's shaken out. The kind of bait and switch that this show pulls is pretty quick, in that it reveals over time, by the way, spoiler alerts for all of Country Bumpkin, and you can go watch it now on Amazon Prime. But the bait and switch that the show pulls, it's like the fantasy setting is a very typical fantasy medieval setting, but medieval-esque setting with like swords and sorcery and like there's a religious order and there's a pope and all that stuff. But the storytelling is about a country sword school teacher who ends up happening to have trained the best swordsman masters in the country, kind of in existence in this show's parlance. And what that looks like is, it looks like once he's exposed to the world, everybody's like, oh, you're the master of most people who are actually pretty good at what they do. And people respect him for that, but he has no reference. He was just doing his job the entire time. And this show does a really good job, and believe me, I will get to its faults in a minute. But this show does a really good job of crafting a character who's in his 30s, who's very much just doing his job, and doesn't like. He has a sense of pride of trying to be the best teacher he can be, but he doesn't recognize himself as this like end all be all best swordsman in the world. He's not this super powered guy who rarely shows it and is kind of lazy like Shunsui from Bleach, for example. But he is this character who knows a lot and who actually has a lot of very specific skills And while the show doesn't exactly treat him like he's this end-all, be-all, all-powerful master, he does eke out wins constantly. And what that looks like is different each time. But the show does a really good job of saying, like, he doesn't have some magical powers. It's not like he is just the best. It's very clear that he has a ton of experience and that he can map that experience onto actual combat. And they give you a good idea of why all of his students that you meet throughout the show realize, like, oh, he did a really good job as a teacher. And the start of the show is one of his students, a character who's the head of the country they live in, like Royal Knights, Alucia, who very clearly has a crush on him, but we'll get to that in a second, shows up at his dojo and says, like, hey, we need a swordsmanship instructor. I want you to do it. And he just kind of goes with the flow and goes with the punches, but in actuality, he's, like, being shown to be a very talented sword person, only he doesn't have the reference point to be a super talented sword, to, like, know what that means or know what that looks like in a way that's super, impactful to him. He very clearly, like, is a big fish in a very small pond, and he gets plucked out and not put in the ocean, but he gets put in a lake. And where everyone can see, like, oh, this guy's a big deal. Only once again, they write him like he's a 30-year-old, like he's not the hottest shit in the world. He a really good swordsman and a really good swordsmanship instructor, in fact. Like, they show him teaching people and they show him sparring with people and, like, making sure they learn the things they should learn. But he's not conceited about it. There's no I'm the chosen one out of any of this. In fact, the show treats him so much like the chosen one that it's a little ridiculous, because his character is just kind of like, I didn't want to be part of the escort guard for the prince and the princess, but I can't say no, I don't think, so I'm gonna end up doing this nonsense. And that would be one thing if they just brought that aspect of it down a notch. But like I said, you have the character of Alucia, who shows up and clearly has a crush on him. Later you meet a blonde character, I forget her name, who was also his student. And without kind of fail, the thing about this show that really, that brings it in, there's a couple things about the show that bring it into a weird place. First, as these shows go, it's pretty generic looking. Like, the designs are interesting and unique, sure, but they're nothing that you wouldn't have seen in, like, the backgrounds of something like, Wisteria Wand and Sword. Or something along the lines of that kind of fantasy show. But the other things that bring it into a weird place are the fact that, like, all of his former students, with the exception of, I think, one, who ends up being a blacksmith, are, of course, hot women half his age who just, they want to get some, they want to get some, just full stop. And to the show's credit, it writes him pretty straight. And I think it was Jeff Sue from Mother's Basement said that he's just autistic enough to not notice that they're hitting on him. But I think the show addresses it pretty clearly. Like, he doesn't even consider these girls as options. Any of the women as options. Because they were his students, because he is like at least a good 10 years older than them. In many cases, he's a good 20 or maybe even 30 years older than him. The character who shows up named Mui, who is straight up just a teenager, who's like 16. And the show goes out of its way to like allow for like age gap relationships, like potential with him, with like Alucia and him, or Serena and him, or even Facile and him, who are all like, those are all names of former students. But with Mui, it instantly treats Mui like, oh hey, you're a troubled youth. Like, the things that's going to happen here is this is going to be less of a like romantic kind of loving relationship, and they shift it really quickly into being a adopted father-daughter relationship. And what that looks like can feel totally fantasy fulfilling, and like you've always imagined of having like a doting, loving daughter. But it's a very different take. It's a very different approach. And I'm not saying that there aren't characters who are like, this character looks like a child, so we're gonna like play that up. There's a character named Lucy who her design is made to look like she is younger than Yui, although she says like it's one of those, I may look like I'm 5, but I'm actually a 700-year-old elf kind of situations. But the character writing for Garnet is for Beryl Garnet. I said Beryl Garnet is his full name, but the character writing for Beryl is such that he treats his character treated like he is the age he is, like he is a full-on adult, and like that the idea of, at least so far in the first season, I'm not sure if this will get a second season. I have no idea of how well this did, but and we'll get to why I think that in a second. The character treats himself like an adult, and like somebody who's had an authority figure for a lot of the women he's encountering, and being like, oh yeah, you were in my class like 5 years ago, you were in my class like 10 years ago, you were a young kid who didn't have a place to stay, so like you stayed with us for like a year or two, and I taught you swordsmanship in that time. Like it makes it very clear that like all the like female characters have real crushes on Beryl, but he doesn't reciprocate. And it's pretty clear that he notices it over time, and he's like, oh, I'm just gonna have to deal with this. They all clearly have like these puppy dog love eyes for me, and I just have to deal with that as like an authority figure who sometimes students have crushes on their teachers. I can't control that. I can only control my reaction to it. And students have crushes on their teachers. Regardless of like the rest of the show, that part of it, and like the treatment of his character is really interesting to me, because it's not the typical wish fulfillment fantasy where like all the walls break down and it's just like a Hina love fest for the entire show. Not the typical wish fulfillment fantasy where like, but then there's the rest of the show, and that's where we run into a lot of problems, because like I said, the production quality isn't great. they use CGI for a lot of the fight scenes, and I don't know about you, but like it's one thing when it's me standing, moving at like a relatively low pace, in this kind of environment, but when it's a full-on CGI fight scene, it tends to get a little. It takes you out of the kind of vibe of the rest of the show, and when you're shifting from not high budget animation but serviceable animation into CGI, and I understand why they do this. They do it for, for production timeline reasons. It starts to feel kind of like clunky and weird because so much CGI, especially in anime, at that kind of like spend level for CGI, doesn't have weight and doesn't have the kind of gravity that you expect from a fight scene. A great example of what I mean here is if you look at something like, say, Princess Mononoke, and you look at the fight scenes in Princess Mononoke, those hits have weight, they have consequence, they feel kind of spontaneous in the way that a fight should feel. Meanwhile, in something like this show, it almost feels like they're being puppeted, and like stuff feels like it feels like there's certain physics missing. And I understand that like it's budget constraints, it's time constraints, it's all that stuff. But I really appreciate it when shows, especially like this, that do focus a lot on combat, have more weighty fight sequences. And I never really got that out of this show. The other thing about this show, and I don't know what the hell happened here. I didn't watch it in Japanese, but the English script for this show is awful. It's so bad. It's like stunningly bad. And that would be one thing if the voice acting wasn't also awful. And I don't recognize a whole bunch of the voices in it. Doesn't mean that they're not common voices. But actually I think I might recognize Beryl. But the long and short of it is it's just not like I think the way I described it in my notes was this thing is written like dog shit and acted even worse. And what that means is every part of this show feels stilted because when the characters are talking to each other, which is most of the time, it doesn't feel like it's coming out right. And like it has real, as you know, I'm your adopted daughter, Beryl, and I only kind of love you kind of delivery vibes. That's not even that far off from a kind of delivery in this show. And that, like, you package that with a lot of tell don't show exposition, and it starts to weigh on the thing. This idea of a like guy in his 30s being discovered and brought up for his talent as a teacher is a really interesting thing. And then the like stuff around it brings it down so hard. And I really wish it didn't, but I don't know what to do about the kind of otakuisms of this show. And what I mean by that is like you have this great what if scenario of there's a guy who lives in a small country village who has quietly been training people in swordsmanship for decades, and it's become clear to kind of everybody who's learned under him that he was exceptional. Let's go get him, bring him up into like our world and give him a station that we think he deserves. That's one thing. That's a really good idea. It gives you an interesting character. It gives you a way for the story to start to happen. And I'm even okay with him getting roped into like Royal Guard duty and all this other stuff. But the kind of harem aspect of this, the wish fulfillment aspects of this, which are only being half met because they did a good job with Beryl as a character. Like, he feels like a 30-year-old trying to figure it the fuck out. And in contrast to the rest of the cast, who just makes hard eyes at him every time he's on screen, to the point where, like, you see a female character and, like, you kind of start checking watch. You're like, it's been 5 seconds since they introduced this female character. How are we gonna either retcon or finagle this character into just wanting to jump Beryl's bones, like, without fail? If this show does get another season, there's a princess character, and all I see in this princess character is like, oh, that princess character is going to become devoted to Beryl, because that's the kind of show this is. And look, I'm not asking for this show to pass the Bechdel test. I know that'll never happen. But I am asking for this show to, like, commit a little harder to its good idea, to, like, let up off the pedal of, say, its, like, female character centricness, centering around Beryl as a character, and even the, like, ultimate bad guy of kind of the last arc of the show is one of, once again, spoilers for all of Country Bumpkin, for all of the first season of Country Bumpkin, is a character named Rose, who is revealed to have been one of Beryl's students, and she ends up being coerced by the church to, like, kill the prince of another country, of another country where the church is actually located. And they could have made that character not related to him in any way. It would have been more interesting, actually, if she wasn't related to him. This is almost, I find it kind of interesting, actually. This is almost incessant need to try and create an immediate emotional connection between the main character and any character of consequence in this world. And they try and shorthand it by making them all former students, or in the case of it, with the exception of Mui. And Mui kind of works the best out of all of them because they give you her full story. And they don't try and shorthand it by just saying, hey, this person was a student of Beryl's, you know, this many years ago. And he remembers them when they're a kid. Isn't it cool and sexy that they're a hot lady now? Mui is, you get her whole backstory, everything. They show it to you. They sit you down, they're like, this is who this character is. Now we're going to plop her into the main cast. And you have this, in fact, better relationship with kind of Yui's character and her arc, and you care about her in a way that you don't care about Alicia or Serena or, you know, Rose or Karuni. That's the blonde character I mentioned earlier. But, and don't get me wrong, I am a sucker for, like, I'll take the most tenuous of connections. But this doesn't even really measure up to that, because the way it treats it is, like, yes, Alicia is, like the character of Alicia being pointed out, being his student, makes sense. It's what starts the story. But at a point, almost every female character you're introduced to, with the exception of, I think I can count one hand, the princess, Mui, and Lucy, that's 3 out of a whole gaggle of female characters, all have some pre-existing off-screen, not shown unless it's a flashback in the moment you meet them, relationship with Beryl. And one of the things I like the most about long-running shonen is that it gets to take the time to do insane shit. Say what you will about Bleach, but Bleach spent so much time with all of the court guard captains, all of the different characters, that when you ultimately found, when you get to a certain point, they're like essentially swapping characters in and out around Ichigo. And Ichigo has rapport and a relationship with all of those characters. And you've largely seen that relationship, if you've seen anything else of Bleach aside from what you're watching at that moment. So when Kenpachi shows up, they've done the work to say, hey, this relationship is valuable. You know, we're having this you're in conversation with this relationship as they're talking to each other, as they're fighting together, all this other stuff. Like I said earlier, this show is trying to shorthand that. And it's trying to end run that in record time. They're trying to tell you this relationship matters, trust us, buy into it. But it doesn't. You have to do a much better job of fleshing that out in a super short time if you want it to count for something like what is counted for in the practice of the character relationships in Bleach, or the character relationships in Naruto or One Piece. The benefit of actually, let's start it this way. The flaw of long-running shonen is the amount of time they tell their story in. Even something like One Piece is forever long. If you didn't get started back in the One Piece rap era in America, you're a little screwed. You have thousands of episodes to catch up. You have over 1,000 episodes to catch up on. But the advantage of that is and I've mentioned this a bunch of times on the podcast, but I'm going to mention it again because I'm insane, and I do really value this concept. The advantage of that is you spend almost an insane amount of time with the characters and in the world, and you end up having this necessity to tell these little bits and bobs of things about the characters and about the world. So in Naruto, for example, by the time you're halfway through Boruto, you know how the mail is delivered in Konoha. You know very specific, weird things you shouldn't know about the Naruto universe because the show just ran for too long. Famously, in Dragon Ball, you know how Goku got his driver's license. That's incredible. But what lots of people consider to be filler does, if it's done well, is it fills in the gaps. It makes the world more real and lived in. And what this show is doing is it's using your understanding of what that looks like and hoping that you'll accept a kind of, for lack of a better term, shortcut to it. It's hoping that you'll accept the kind of teacher-student relationship as a shortcut to what a relationship means on screen. When I don't think that it actually really... I don't think that it's I think the idea is good, but I think that the execution is bad. And part of the reason I think the execution is bad is A, because the writing is awful and the voice acting is even worse. But at least in my opinion, but the amount of time devoted to being like, hey, this is this character, it just isn't long enough. And I know that seems odd, and I know that's asking a lot from a 12-episode show, and maybe they just didn't have the budget or the time to do a longer thing. But I think if you spent, and maybe in future seasons they'll do this, and I know that this is a hard lift for a show in its very first season, but if you spent time beyond, Alicia gets enough time, but if you spent time with the other characters in flashbacks, the way that you get to spend time with Mui and in her story, then I think that the kind of relationship bonds in this show would feel more real, and they would feel more weighty, and you would get this like sense of importance to like why Karuni likes Beryl so much, why Serena is so like jealous of Alicia. Or even caricature like blank slate characters like Facile. Facile is this like kind of like kudere, very blank slate, very matter of fact character who doesn't show up that often. The show doesn't make a whole lot of use of her. But if they gave you like a whole episode or two just focused on like, oh yeah, she's always been like this. This is like her deal. It doesn't mean that she's like any less attached. It's just she expresses herself a different way. Then you'd actually do the work of building the relationship. Tenjo Tenge is this insane thing, and it's not necessarily the best thing all the time. But one thing that it does really well is it says, hey, we're dropping these two characters, Toshiro Nagi and Bob Makihara, tiny short stack, angry, blonde, Japanese guy, and a giant, muscle-bound black guy, into the middle of this toxic soup of relationships and pre-existing nonsense. And then most of that show, most of that thing is great, just being like, oh, you have no idea how tenuous this is. Let me sit you down and explain it. Let me show you why, Taura is kind of like, just kind of there. Let me show you why Mitsuomi got all fucked up and high on his own supply. Let me show you why the Natsumi family is all cursed. And then when you zoom back out into the present day in that show, they've shown you what the hell's happening. They've shown you the fact that, like, oh, by the way, spoilers for Tenjo Tenge, but which I'll probably talk about at some point in this podcast. But they show you what the deal is with Aya, what the deal is with her older sister Maya, what those relationships are, and why they feel so interesting and lived in immediately without you really seeing anything there. Like I said, the show doesn't have the runtime to do that, but in my estimation, if you don't have the runtime to devote to it, what are you doing? These relationships, you're being told, are important enough for you to care about, but they're not doing the work to show you the relationship. Once again, with the exception of, like, one or two characters, aka Alicia, who as the first character that they do that trick with, she gets away with it scot-free. Like she shows up at a door, and she's like, "You've always been the strongest swordsman I've ever encountered or learned from. Here, we want you to come teach from in the capital, blah, 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 blah." She gets the benefit of the doubt because she's the introductory character. She's the character who opens up the doors to the story in the first place. Once again, Miui's whole story is shown on screen. And they just don't... And I know that, like, all the backstory stuff and all the current day stuff would take a long time. But, and I'm doing a lot of, like, reconstructing of this show and whatever, but what if the first season of this show was you meeting characters and then the next episode was an episode devoted to them and, like, what their deal is and where they came from, instead of just, oh, there's Serena. She was an orphan we took in. Moving on. Wait, what? Hold on. There's a whole episode, at least in that part of this, that they just didn't do. And the show suffered because of it. Because, like I said, Beryl's character is really strong. The concept is there. But just the surrounding pieces don't elevate it to be better. And it ends up being kind of forgettable trash when it shouldn't be. The really interesting thing about the other 30 character in their 30s of late, Kafka Hibino, is they do a really good job in a way that has a lot of shorthand of giving his story a lot of gravity and making you care about his story, because it's his last chance and something good happens for him. And, like, he gets into the, like, kaiju hunt, the kaiju extermination program like he always dreamed. Like he promised his crush slash childhood friend. And they do the setup there, and they absolutely use shorthand and the writer of Kaiju Number 8 absolutely uses shorthand to to create a relationship between those two characters. But by engineering the world to make that shorthand work, and then like spiraling that out to a full thing, you get something that works a lot better. You get characters. You don't have to rely on this constant, like, deluge of characters who were his student once, but you never get to see that. It would be a lot more interesting to me if Alicia, and there's a character, I forget his name, but there's a male character who just doesn't believe that this guy is worth shit. And so he challenges Beryl to a sparring match, to a sparring duel. And Beryl schools him hard. And after that, he's like, oh Jesus. Alicia wasn't kidding. This guy's the real deal. And like the entire, like, you see the like Royal Knight's eyes light up with, like, oh, Alicia was serious. And later they do it again with Alicia challenging him for plot reasons. And when he beats her, everybody's like, oh, no, like, in case we forgot, Beryl's constantly on one. And if they treated his character like that, and you can even, tweak it so, like, they all fall in love with him because of his incredible skill, blah, 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 blah. it feels less. It feels less wish fulfilling and more grounded than, oh, I remember you from when you were a little girl. Now you want to bang me. What? And like I said, I think the show is interesting at the very least. I don't necessarily think it's very good, but I thought it was interesting enough to like keep watching it week to week and also to talk about here. So this is actually where I'm gonna leave it. But I will catch you guys in the next one.